Hello everyone, my name's John Darlington and I'm the Executive Director of World Monuments Fund in Britain, and it's my pleasure tonight to be the host to this session with World Monuments Fund where we're celebrating the Newstead Abbey in Nottinghamshire. So it's great that so many people could join us, particularly since this is a reschedule from the event that we had last month, and indeed many more people have actually joined us, so in many ways that was a great success. So delighted that you could all be here. I'm going to be joined later in this event by my two special guests who will be helping me to celebrate Newstead Abbey. We have Zoe Skelding from Purcell, who's an architect and partner. And later on, we'll be having Emily Brand, who is the author and historian who has a particular expertise in the Byron family. So we're very much looking forward to hearing from them. Before I go into and introduce both Zoe and Emily, what I'd like to do is just give you a little bit of an idea of what we're going to do this over the next hour, and then perhaps give a tiny bit of context to illustrate why World Monuments Fund is involved in this abbey in Nottinghamshire. So in terms of the run of play, what's going to happen is I'm going to give a little bit of context next. Then I'm going to hand over to Zoe, who's going to talk about the restoration work on the west front at Newstead. Zoe will be talking for about 10 minutes. I'll then be handing over from Zoe straight to Emily, who's going to be populating the cloisters and the corridors and the landscape with some of the people who actually lived at Newstead Abbey. So we're going to go from a conservation story through to the people who inhabited this important building. Then after that, we'll have the opportunity to have some questions and answers. So I'm encouraging everyone, please use the chat function down the side, and we'll keep that under review. And at the end, there should be plenty of time to ask those questions and get answers as well. So that's the plan. Before I hand over to Zoe, though, I thought it would be useful just to give you some very basic facts for those of you who don't know the Abbey, so that you're in the right frame of mind to understand what we're talking about in general terms. The first thing to say is that Newstead is an Augustinian priory founded in the 12th century by Henry II. Its main period of construction is in the 13th century and onward. So it grows as a priory. It grows to this an important institution servicing a local area. By the time of the dissolution of the monasteries, Henry VIII has ordered the priory to be closed, and it closes in 1537. I'm an archaeologist, I deal in centuries, not specific dates. 1537, and then from 1540. The institution is purchased by the Byron family, who hold it all the way up until 1818, when Lord Byron sells it on. It then has another checkered period of history with lots of interesting individuals before it's handed over to the essentially Nottingham City Council, who currently own it. The issue with the Abbey and why World Monuments Fund is involved is because the Abbey itself needed help. It's a massive conservation challenge. So a group put it forward as a potential World Monuments Watch site way back in 2012. And from 2012 onwards, we've been working with a variety of partners who include the newly formed then Newstead Abbey Partnership, a very important local group who champion the Abbey, working with the owners, Nottingham City Council, and with Historic England to plan a campaign of restoration which will restore particularly the west front of this important building. That restoration piece concluded in December of last year, and this is a moment because of that, because the work is concluded, when we can report back on some of the discoveries and the process that was made. So it's at this stage, I say no more, and I hand over to Zoe Skelding, who was the lead for Purcell's conservation and who was responsible for leading the conservation campaign on the West Front. So over to you, Zoe.
Thank you, John. Yes, I'm Zoe Skelding, partner at Purcell, conservation architect, and it's a pleasure to be here today to talk to you about the conservation works at Newstead. The image that we're showing now is the left of the west front of the Abbey, the former west gable. When you look through the structure, you can see that it would have been a large building and a substantial priory church. The standing remains are composed of 3 bays with blind arcading, string courses, a moulded balustrade, pinnacles and gargoyles. There are 4 gabled buttresses, each with a gabled niche. These arrangements gave the impression of an aisled central nave, but there was only ever a central nave and a north aisle. Architecturally, this is a very rare and early example of aesthetics rather than function dictating form. Next slide. The West Front was on the at-risk register, a list kept by Historic England of important buildings with significant vulnerabilities. A key aspiration of the project was to remove the West Front from this register. Whilst the structure was generally in sound repair, there were some localised, very significant issues which required urgent attention due to health and safety concerns of falling masonry. The funding from the World Monument Fund and Historic England was essential to enable the conservation works of the West Front. In order to diagnose and specify the repairs, it was necessary to carry out a high-level survey from a cherry picker or MUP. So this is a photograph from the cherry picker looking down on the gables and the pinnacles of the priory church. The principal issues we identified as part of the survey were that the gargoyles had thinned significantly, making their heads very vulnerable to frost damage. The pinnacles appeared to be suffering from crown damage and were seen to be gently rocking. The niche canopies were cracked, and the approach steps had suffered movement and the paving through the arches was in poor condition. Small sections of stonework had fallen from high level, leading to the West Front being cordoned off from public access. Next slide. The Abbey is a scheduled monument and Grade 1 listed, and this is the highest grading for historic buildings in the UK. These are some of the images from Historic England Archive, which are dated 1892, 1950 and 1967. And they're a great resource telling some of the story of the ruin and the repairs that have been carried out over that 75-year period. The relative completeness of the finials and the extent of the vegetation are of interest. In 1892, the finials are complete, but the top course is noticeably paler in colour, which presumably indicates replacement stone, and there's some dense ivy in the west section of the building around the west window. The vegetation has been cleared by 1950, but the tops of the finials are missing again. And in 1967, the tops of the finials again have been replaced. In terms of specifying the repairs, it must be accepted that this structure is a ruin. Specific measures must be taken to address this, restoring or without destroying or the essence of the structure, only to mitigate or prevent further delay. Next slide, please. The scaffold for the repair works was a fairly impressive structure. The scaffold was a fully working scaffold tied between the 2 sides of the monument with a lifting beam on the upper lift of the scaffold. On the next slide, you can see the lifting beam in action for works to the pinnacles. Next slide, please. The West Front is in an exposed position, particularly from the south and the west, and it's not surprising that the exposed elements, and particularly these pinnacles, show lots of weathering and erosion. The failure of the pinnacle tops and the risks involved in disassembling them were a concern to the project team. The main problem appeared to be the top sections, which had previously been replaced with new stone, and it was unclear how they were fixed. There was some cracking of the joint between the replacement section and the original stone, and in one case, this has also affected adjacent stones. The pinnacles were seen as a major risk item, both for those visiting the Abbey from a health and safety point of view, but also for the budget, should any of the replacement stone or major rebuilding be required. The pinnacles were found to rock from inspection on the cherry picker, and once on site, it was an early work item to do a trial dismantling of one of the pinnacle stones. And that's the image that you're seeing there of the workers dismantling the pinnacles. The stones were found to be threaded on to a very slender piece of copper piping, and the mortar bedding had failed with a lack of packing of the joint and no grouting, leading to the swaying of the pinnacles. Each of the pinnacles were very carefully dismantled, and the copper piping was replaced with a larger diameter stainless steel dowel, which was carefully rebedded and regrouted. Thankfully, due to the care taken by the contractor, the existing stone could all be reused. Next slide, please. Another of the key defects was that several of the grotesques had suffered some very significant thinning to the necks. This has led to the heads being very vulnerable to frost damage and had the potential to crack off, leading to falling masonry. So if you look to the photograph on the left, that shows the type of condition that the grotesques were found in. As part of the works, we repaired the cracks and the loose masonry was removed. However, 6 of the grotesques had very significant thinning. And for those, we looked at a variety of different details for how to stabilize and support them. And we devised a system of cradling or restraining the heads using the stainless steel mesh fixed back with dowels and washers to the more stable body zone, which is the image shown on the right. This enabled all of the grotesques to be retained. Next slide, please. Another vulnerable area was the crocket details, some of which were very cracked and vulnerable. You can perhaps see some of the cracking on the photographs on the right. Some of the sections which have a very high surface area to volume ratio are particularly susceptible, and it's not surprising that many of them were severely eroded or missing. All of the crockets were surveyed, and any that were unstable were pinned using stainless steel micropins and given a shelter coat to stabilize. Next slide, please. This slide shows the effects of the salts on the magnesium limestone. These are the niches on the front of the buttresses to the west side, which create a particular microclimate, which has led to greater erosion in these areas, causing cracking. The niche is a very delicate design with a substantial canopy supported on 4 circular columns. The exposure and the amount of salts that have accumulated, which have not been washed off by rainwater, have contributed to very significant decay of the canopy stones. The west front has been subject to pollution, and particularly sulfur dioxide, and the salts are a product of this. Although the Abbey is in a rural setting, centres of industry like Nottingham and Derby are downwind of the Abbey. In general, these salts will be washed off in more exposed areas, but these protected areas are very susceptible. So stainless steel pins were again inserted across the cracks, and you can see that in the top right hand photographs of the works in progress. Next slide, please. And another very common problem with ruins is that they become hosts to vegetation and biological growth. So the photographs that you can see here are some very substantial buddleia roots and a fir tree growing out of one of the ledges on the rear of the west front. There were many tens of bags of moss also removed from the monument. These aren't generally damaging, but they do cover up the condition of the stone beneath, and they need to be fully removed for assessment and repair and repointing. All the lichens were left in place, however. If we could go to the next slide. The removal of the vegetation allowed some of the fabulous stone carving to be seen afresh, and I've just captured 3 of the faces from the monument for you to see here, which are at very high level and sometimes quite difficult to see. The stone on the west-facing elevation is of ashlar stone, and the rear former internal elevation is coarse rubble stone. The original Mansfield White is from a local quarry, and it's still substantially constructed with this type of magnesium limestone. However, the Limby quarry closed in 2013 due to the poor quality of the stone. But thankfully, this project was able to meet its aspiration of retaining all existing stonework with no new stone required. But this is a problem that might pose issues for future phases of conservation. And if I could have the next slide, please. These are also some further details uncovered, with the carving on the right showing some much older but still legible details of animal and vegetation. The mason mouse clutching his chisel and mallet on the left dates only to 1982 for the restoration that carried out much of the upper level of the coping stones. If we could go to the next slide. The works at the Abbey are now complete, but hopefully this has given you a sense of the amount of detailed work that's gone into conserving the monument. And this is thanks to the funding of the World Monument Fund and Historic England, which together with Nottingham City Council, we have been able to safeguard the future of the west front of the Abbey. Thank you.
Zoe, thank you so very much for that. We gave Zoe a real challenge, which was to condense a conservation programme into 10 minutes, which I think you did admirably. And actually those slides just illustrate the conservation challenge itself. The amount of erosion and corrosion is just frightening in a way. So it's good to have that sorted. I'm sure there'll be some questions for Zoe at the end, but next we'll turn to our second guest, and that's Emily. Now, Emily, at the same time as our conservation work was happening on the west front of the Abbey, Emily was produced or published this book. So we thought we couldn't resist bringing those two things together, as say, the place and the people who lived in the place. So Emily, I'm going to hand straight over to you.
Thank you very much, John. It's amazing to see that part of the Abbey up close and personal. It's brilliant. So I've really enjoyed that. Thank you. I'm just going to dive straight in to this heady world of the Byron dynasty, specifically in the 18th century, which is what I've been researching for the last 4 years. As adventures and drama go, this family is really remarkable, and there are so many different strands to their story, and it begins here at Newstead Abbey, but then it stretches out across revolutionary France, storms in South America, freezing cold fishing towns in Canada, and much further. And over the course of this century, it takes in shipwrecks, murder trial, some very close calls during the American Revolution, and in true 18th century style, lots of adultery and elopement as well, which is obviously great fun. But this story has been almost completely overshadowed by their most famous descendant, the Byron everyone knows and loves, or as hates, as I've found actually, over the course of the last year or so. And this is the scandalous poet, George, the 6th Lord Byron here, who took up his title and the Abbey in 1798 as a 10-year-old boy. And he inherited from his elderly great-uncle William, the 5th Lord Byron, who even on his deathbed had never bothered to find out who his heir was or how they were related. And this supposedly wicked or mad Lord Byron is who I'm going to be looking at most closely today. But before that, I just want to dwell for a moment on the poet's fascination with his ancestry, because it colours his whole life. It helps to form his own sense of identity. It inspires lots of his poetry, and he also uses it to explain or excuse some of his own temperament and his often dreadful behaviour. And his frustrated mother Catherine didn't help, I think, as we can see from this quote from his teenage years, when if he behaved selfishly or disrespectfully, she told him that he would be a true Biron, which was the worst epithet she can invent. From his first tour of Newstead, he was completely enchanted by both the Abbey itself, which had fallen almost completely into ruin by this point, and also its ghosts. So some of his earliest poems focus on the Abbey, and they pay tribute to the stories of his heroic, battle-worn ancestors that he so admired. In truth, a lot of this was embellished. Some of it, there's not really any evidence, so he's probably done a bit of imagining as well there. But it's a shame, because the true history of the Abbey, to be honest, it really required no invention, and it was so much richer than just playing host to a troop of military men. So just to really rattle through very quickly, we've had some of this from John, but the Abbey comes into Byron hands with the dissolution of the monasteries in the reign of Henry VIII. And then over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, it's home to a string of brilliant characters. We have the fantastically named Sir John with the great beard. If you Google that, or if you go to Newstead itself, you can see that beard in all its glory. We meet an heir who dropped dead because he was laughing so hard at one of his own practical jokes. We have a baroness driven mad by childbirth, and a couple who were so in love that they supposedly died on the very same day. Into the Restoration era, we have a royal mistress who was branded a whore by Samuel Pepys, and an old lord tricked into signing away his estates after his children got him drunk. And this brings us up to the drama that I focus on, which is the poet's grandparents and parents' generation. So it's a prequel, it's an origin story of the poet, really. And this begins in 1720 and follows the dynasty's fall from grace and that near destruction of the Abbey. So on to the next slide. A quick family tree always helps here, because this family is just full of Williams and Georges. So I hope this will set us up for the rest of the talk. But here we have at the top the 51-year-old William, 4th Lord Byron. He's got no heirs, they've all died. So he marries 17-year-old Frances Berkeley in 1720, and as this age difference suggests, this is absolutely a marriage of convenience. It's arranged by his lordship and Frances's father, who has this troop of daughters to marry off, quite Mr. Bennet-like. Nonetheless, she fulfills her wifely duties with amazing efficiency. Under a year after the wedding, in 1721, comes their first child, Isabella. Almost exactly a year later comes the much needed heir, William, who will become the 5th Lord Byron. Again, almost exactly a year later, John, who will be the adventurer of the family. In 1724, Richard, 1726, Charles, and finally in 1730, George. So in under 10 years, Frances, poor Frances, has provided one daughter and, more importantly, of course, 5 boys to secure this dynasty. And it is thanks to Frances that the Byron line has continued through to the present day. Now, all of these, with the exception of George, were baptised at Newstead, probably born at Newstead. And this is where their mother carved their names and their birthdays on a bedchamber window pane with a diamond, which I think is just a gorgeous way of recording it. But it is immeasurably irritating for historians because, unsurprisingly, that window pane hasn't survived. It was removed and then goes missing in the early 19th century. So we can blame the poet for that, actually. And these are the Byron siblings who form the heart of my book, especially the 3 eldest, whose stories are really compelling in completely different ways. So if we go on to the next slide, we will see them. Today, I'm focusing mostly on William because he was the heir, he was the owner of Newstead, but I can't totally neglect Isabella and John, because their lives are entwined and they're just brilliant characters in their own right. So this lilac powdered portrait of Isabella on the left, her story is one of a totally hopeless romantic and of a spirited woman just determined to live life as she saw fit. Like her mother, she married a much older man to become Countess of Carlisle and mistress of Castle Howard up near York. So this was a hugely advantageous match for her, and she immediately outranked the rest of the Byron family. But she quickly gained a reputation for loving the high life a little bit too much, and especially for flirtation. And this became increasingly scandalous after she was widowed in her early 30s, and she basically spends her 30s and her 40s chasing various toy boy baronets around, and then even more shockingly tripping across Europe with a German soldier who she was trying and failing to pass off as a nobleman. Now, as you can imagine, this didn't do her reputation back home any good whatsoever, but when she was forced to return to England, her response was to publish an etiquette guide for unmarried young ladies. And this was as the fashionable world was just ushering its wives and daughters away from her in the street. So it was quite a move. But loads of her letters have survived, some of her love letters as well. So we can get a really rich picture of her emotional life and her personality. On the right, then we've got John, and John is the grandfather of the poet and nicknamed Foul-Weather Jack by the press. So that's how he's gone down in history. And his most famous adventure came as a 17-year-old midshipman when his ship, the HMS Wager, was wrecked just off the coast of Chile in 1741. And what follows is, I think, one of the most amazing survival stories in history. It includes mutiny, starvation, near cannibalism, murder, and being locked in a Spanish dungeon. And this is how the crew are just gradually picked off one by one. He does survive, though, and goes on to make a real name for himself. So in the 1760s, he completes a record-breaking circumnavigation of the globe. He claims the Falklands for Britain, so kicks off a lasting controversy there. And he paves the way for Captain Cook's voyages to Australia a couple of years after him, hence the naming of Byron Bay. At his death, John left behind 6 children to squabble over their inheritance, and the worst among them was his eldest son, Jack Byron, whose own son, George, goes on to become the poet. So that's the link there. But it was the birth of William in the middle on Bonfire Night 1722 that their father had been waiting for. Now, this is a 19th century illustration that captures the outlandish myths that have risen around him since his life, and particularly from the 19th century. In Nottinghamshire legend, he's remembered for two particular crimes. First, for so-called murdering his distant cousin in a tavern dispute, and second, for laying waste to Newstead, to this treasured estate and art collection. And there are also very persistent rumours of orgies and Satan worship, but I'm sorry to say I haven't yet found any actual historical evidence for that. On to the next slide. If we can, there we go. I just want to go back to the beginning. This painting depicts Newstead in around 1730. So this is the childhood country home that these siblings would have known during their long summers, surrounded by all this lush woodlands, as you can see. And their father, the fourth Lord, as well as embarking on this dynastic project with his new young wife, had recently thrown himself into renovations at the Abbey. So he remodels much of the front of the mansion in the middle there. He creates this pristine courtyard, and he's assembled a collection of artistic masterpieces, including Da Vinci, Holbein and Rubens, and it draws visitors from across the country during their summer tours. And happily for us, he was also an amateur artist. So we're really spoiled to have an endless supply of paintings and sketches of the Abbey from almost every angle at this time. This was clearly a labour of love for the fourth Lord, and it was intended as his lasting legacy. But then in August 1736, the fourth Lord dies somewhere within these walls, and Newstead's fate took a turn as his son William became the fifth Lord Byron at just 13. And it wasn't the hugest inheritance in the world, but thanks to his father's caution, it was well in credit. So he had profitable lands across Nottinghamshire and Lancashire, this estate at Newstead, and even after paying his father's debts, he had the equivalent of well over £1 million in modern money on top of this. Now, he couldn't legally take full control of this inheritance until he turned 21. But even as a young man, it becomes very clear that he has plans. More than that, he has a hugely grandiose vision of himself and what he wants to create at the Abbey. And it's also clear that he has no intention of sharing, to the point that he takes his own mother to court at the age of 18 when he suspects that she is selling things from the estate, from his property. And this dispute in 1740 gives us an absolutely brilliant resource for Newstead. It's a full household inventory listing every item in every room, from the harpsichord and bagpipes in the Great Gallery to describing unframed portraits scrolled up and stacked against the walls, to how many teapots and cheese boards there were in the servants' quarters. We learn that the teenage Isabella's bedroom is furnished with yellow plaid and the walls are covered in tapestries, and that the two younger brothers share a room decorated in red with a big model of a ship. So we get this fantastic, almost living picture of every room in the house. When he does come into his inheritance, and also that of his newly acquired heiress wife, William, the fifth Lord, follows his father's example, and he just starts to lavish money on Newstead, but his taste is very different. He really leans into the Gothic style before it takes on, catches on around much of the country. He builds a miniature castle, which we'll see a picture of later, battlements around the lake. He's all about turrets, and he cultivates a sort of rugged wildness about the estate that probably would have horrified his father, but many visitors commented on how romantic and wild everything looked. He was also spending money at London auctions on more artistic treasures, and children from the neighbouring estates were particularly excited when he started commissioning replica warships with which he staged mock battles on the lake. And his brother John also was bringing him back souvenirs from all of his travels, so spears from indigenous peoples around the world, and even a shaggy Newfoundland dog from Canada. So it's just packed with all sorts of curiosities. So what went wrong? The legends cemented in the 19th century blamed two things. First, that after a scandalous duel, William hid himself away at Newstead, never to venture out again. Second, that he was so enraged by his son's elopement with a penniless girl that he purposefully laid waste to the abbey and ruined the family inheritance out of spite. So this is partly why he's got this nickname, a posthumous nickname, admittedly, the Wicked Lord. But neither of these are exactly true, but I do want to take a closer look at the reality of both episodes. So on to the next slide for the first one. And here we are in London in January 1765. William is 42 and he has been battling this reputation for childishness, arrogance and cowardice for the best part of 20 years. Now, the Nottinghamshire Club are meeting for food and drink here at the Star and Garter, which we can see in the middle. This is on Pall Mall in London. And a few drinks in, he gets into an argument with William Chalworth. He's a neighbour and a distant cousin he's known since childhood, and they've been in and out of petty disputes for years. So there is a history there. Now, this particular dispute is not very thrilling, I'm afraid. They start arguing about the best methods of maintaining game on an estate, and that spills over into a bet over who has more game on their estate, naturally. But then it develops to misheard remarks about who owns what land. So it's straying into quite dangerous territory of honour there. But basically, Chalworth was annoyed because William was getting angry, he wasn't listening, and William thought that he was being spoken to in a contemptuous manner by someone who was critically his inferior, which obviously he wasn't a fan of. Later on, the discussion was taken to a separate room. Both men drew their swords and lunged. Chalworth missed. William's sword ran right through his opponent's belly and back. And crucially, in understanding what sort of a man William was, his reaction was not one of horror or grief or sorrow. "You might thank yourself for what has happened," he said. "I suppose you took me for a coward, but by God, I have as much courage as any man in England." Chalworth lived for long enough to write a will, but died during that night, while William went home and plotted an impromptu trip to France. He was dragged back a few weeks later, being summoned to be tried for murder, and he was immediately escorted to be held in the Tower of London. Now, this two-day trial itself caused a real sensation because if found guilty of premeditated murder, William would have been hanged, which was obviously a rare spectacle for a peer of the realm. Members of the royal family attended the trial. A whole crowd of noblemen apparently came over from France, and the streets were really crammed with people trying to get a glimpse of the procession to and from the Tower. William, of course, pleaded self-defense, and spoiler alert here, he did ultimately convince the jury, which was made up of his peers in the House of Lords. So having been found guilty of manslaughter only, he was able to escape with just a fine. Contrary to the legend, though this duel did make him notorious, it revived all sorts of gossip about his tyrannical, homicidal tendencies. There is no evidence whatsoever that it made him alter his behaviour. So he immediately goes on an expensive holiday with his sister, where he buys a wolf, because why not? And then when he gets home, he continues attending royal birthday parties and carousing on ships with all of his friends. So really, there's no sign of remorse there. There's no sign of him becoming a recluse. According to the poet who inherited the abbey some 30 years later, William had even displayed that very sword on his bedroom wall as some sort of memento. So on to the next slide. So what of Newstead throughout all of this? Well, after 25 years of careless and very heavy spending, William had an even bigger problem. And we know that in 1736, he'd inherited a very comfortable estate, and then he gave this a huge boost by taking control of his wife's inheritance in his mid-20s. Now, he promptly started selling everything off, all of her property and lands off, and particularly annoyed his mother-in-law because he just sold off her furniture as well without even asking. And she mentioned this in her will, so she clearly wasn't over it many years later. By the time he approached his mid-30s, he began taking out loans, and he was making all sorts of promises and then promptly running off to London or abroad when they started to be called in. He began trying to pay tradesmen with venison from his estate instead of cash, which obviously didn't go down too well. And by 1770, all his usual sources of income, they were just flat out refusing. Even local grocers were refusing to do business with him. And we're very fortunate that Lord Byron's steward at Newstead, Mr. Dawes, kept and preserved very full accounts of all the financial goings on at the Abbey. These are now kept at Nottinghamshire Archives. And Professor John Beckett has calculated from these that by the 1770s, William was in debt to the tune of well over £3 million in modern money, which is really quite remarkable. But he had a plan, and this was to marry off his only son and heir to a wealthy young woman and then use that injection of cash to pay off both of their debts. So it's a really charming 18th century romance story for you. And secondly, to convince his heir to sign a document giving his permission for William to parcel up and start selling off some of the family lands to raise more cash. To cut a long story very short, his heir instead elopes with his highly unprofitable cousin, apparently on the very eve of the wedding day. So he's ruined that particular plan. And though they do sell off some lands, it's nowhere near enough to cover his father's continued spending. It just about covers most of his debts. Even more unhelpfully, the heir then dies 5 years later, meaning that if he wants to sell any more of the lands, Lord Byron has to wait until his infant grandson turns 21 and is able to legally give his permission. So basically, he's stuck with what he's got. And here in the middle, we have, incidentally, that miniature castle that William had built in 1749, where he held elegant parties overlooking the lake and, according to later rumours, also his orgies, who knows. I just wanted to include it because it's since been demolished, but it gives an idea of his own personal taste in terms of theatrics and architectural style. And this is when we begin to see the inevitability of Newstead's gradual fall into ruin. So in 1772, William arranged for an auction of some of the great masterpieces from his art collection. And we can see the front page of the catalogue here on the right from Christie's. And this provided a useful stopgap for a few years, but then we see the really tragic Great Sale of 1778, which virtually stripped Newstead of anything movable. And for us, again, this gives another invaluable glimpse of life at 18th century Newstead, because once again, we're handed a huge list of everything in each room being put up for sale. So we know the furniture, we know the colours of the rooms, and there's a really horrible sounding collection of pickled animals, in animal specimens in jars, and it goes right down to toothpicks and brass hinges. So this is an act of pure desperation on William's part, and the rest of the family obviously looked on in horror as their inheritance was dismantled. This letter on the left is from William to his steward Dawes in 1779, and that shows that even after this great sale, money problems continued. He was constantly griping about money, constantly running off to London to avoid difficult questions, and this sets the pattern really for the rest of his life. So he lived for another 20 years after this, not the mythological recluse at Newstead. He had a small townhouse in London, and he also bought a new villa for himself on Hampstead Heath. And he pops up occasionally in London to wheedle money out of the Prime Minister or the King and paying court to women that he'd had affairs with in his youth. But he's unable to really do very much simply because he didn't have the funds. And by this time, he had alienated most of his friends and family. So his niece described him as a great rogue because he refused to sign any papers to allow them to come into an inheritance unless he got a large portion of it. And a former friend described him as bitter and hostile after his attempts to put Nottinghamshire mills out of business unless they paid him huge sums. So essentially, he was starving the locals, depriving them of their bread here. As for Newstead itself, it fell into disrepair, ceilings began to fall in, rooms were left empty, hay, and then even cattle began to be kept in the mansion for a small price. And when William died in 1798, his remaining assets were valued at under £500, so perhaps around £20,000 today, and that was immediately swallowed up by unpaid legal fees and funeral expenses. A few weeks later, his 10-year-old great-nephew George arrives at Newstead to survey his inheritance as the 6th Lord Byron. It's on to the last slide. The poet's actual residence at the Abbey spanned just 6 years, from 1808 to 1814. And during this time, his mother was often holding the fort as he whisked himself off on trips abroad. But his attachment to the place remained. "Come what may, Newstead and I stand or fall together," he wrote in 1809, finishing definitively, "I will not sell Newstead." It was a promise which, as we know, he was unable to keep. Now, this print is dated around the 1820s, so it shows Newstead roughly as it would have been during the life of the poet, and in all likelihood as it looked when he inherited. But many of the features that we can see here were updated or swept away by subsequent owners. And he viewed his ancestry with a flexible attitude towards the truth, certainly through a rose-tinted lens. And he hated all the vicious rumours that circulated about his relatives, and especially about his father and about his great uncle, the 5th Lord, who were both repeatedly accused of murder, insanity, and wife beating. But he did glory in a morbid kind of a way in this melancholy Gothic inheritance, in this idea of being the last of his line, and in the inevitable decline of humanity that he really becomes to associate Newstead with. And I'll just finish with the teenage poet's own words that we can see here to the half-imagined ghosts of those Byron relatives that he never knew, from on leaving Newstead Abbey around 1803. "Shades of heroes, farewell. Your descendant departing from the seat of his ancestors bids you adieu. Abroad or at home, your remembrance imparting new courage, he'll think upon glory and you." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was a tour de force, again, condensing so much information into a very short period of time. And frankly, I mean, the characters are just extraordinary. Truth is indeed stranger than fiction in this instance. So thank you very much. And it's excellent that we're now rejoined by Zoe, and we've now got some time for questions. So I've got some questions coming through from my phone, as well as questions down the chat and on the Q&A. So please I'd encourage you to use those functions so that we can ask Emily and Zoe some more detail. So my first question is for Emily, and that's one which says, what inspired you to write the book?
Yes, it wasn't the poet, actually. My background is in 18th century history, but it was Isabella. I just came across this portrait of her, and there was virtually no information about her online. And it was that lilac-haired one that you saw at the beginning. It's just gorgeous. And I was just totally intrigued by her. And as I was reading, obviously the name Byron caught me, but as I was reading around her other relatives, her nephew, who's known as Mad Jack, who was the poet's father, and then her brother John, who had these astonishing adventures and shipwrecks across the world for his whole life. It just really drew me in. So I had to go to the archive and find out more about Isabella herself and the other women of the story, because they had been very much neglected in all any scholarship about the family already. But also I'm a Nottinghamshire lass myself, so I sort of jumped at the chance to be able to work on something a bit local that's, you know, not necessarily London centric, and connect it to the global history as well. I just found it a really fascinating task.
Fantastic, and I love that piece around off the coast of Chile and all of that. I mean, that's again, the influence and extent of this family is enormous. Thank you. Okay, I've a question now for Zoe, and that is to do with obviously the bricks and mortar of the abbey, and that is what was the most complicated challenge as part of the restoration?
I think there's a number of elements of complication. I think one is surveying such a large piece of freestanding stonework from ground level at first, and then trying to also, from a cherry picker, ascertain to a very detailed level what the repairs will be to enable us to set a budget and make sure that the works can actually be carried out. So there's no substitute for being on the scaffolding up close and personal, being able to touch the stonework and to be able to understand that. So interpreting that in the early stages is a really difficult thing.
Great, thank you. We've also got another few technical questions for you, Zoe, and that is one which says, you mentioned the fabric was magnesium limestone. Was a dolomitic or calcium lime used for repairs and pointing? There you go, that's one I certainly couldn't answer.
I will look up the technical spec while we are talking, so I will come back and answer that question.
Okay, and another one before we turn back to you, Emily. So final one for you, Zoe, on this kind of thread, and that is, was there a room behind the facade of the west front? So was there a room? I think someone's referring to the blocked up windows, but were there any rooms behind that, or was it straight into the nave and the two aisles?
There would have been on the right hand side of the image that I was showing. So as you look at the west front from the west, there is a room that is part of the abbey onto that side. So that is behind one of the blocked blind windows. Yeah.
Right, thank you. Emily, question for you. And that, again, really interesting one. And this is, do you think myth and legend should play a role within heritage interpretation and the history of the Abbey?
I do. I think in this case, with the Byrons, certainly for in the modern age, it's become so inextricably linked with the history of the family and how they are perceived. I think as long as we're clear about what is myth and perhaps when it first appeared, and investigate why those myths would have appeared, for example, about the Fifth Lord, I think that's a great way to engage people in the stories and really understand their place in the 18th century world as well. And one thing, when I was writing the book, obviously the Fifth Lord, who I've been talking about, was completely veiled in all of these horror stories about, he didn't only kill his cousin, he was accused of killing his wife and shooting his servant and having, worshipping Satan and all of this. And I was hoping that I might be able to find the root of everything and say, he was a lovely man, let's rehabilitate him. But it wasn't the case. Most of it was born of truth. For example, one myth that he had tried to drown his wife in one of the lakes at Newstead, it seemed to come from the fact that he'd once pushed in one of his wife's friends as a joke in the lake, and then it had sort of been whipped up into this frenzy of murderous intent. So I think for some people, that's a really important part of the story.
Great, fantastic. It's, yes, as you say, it's why do those myths come into being? Because there is a grain of truth in that, and that in itself is really interesting. Some other questions coming through about where did Lord Byron the poet live before he moved into Newstead Abbey? Presumably there were several homes.
Sure. So he, as I say, he inherited in 1798. Before then, he'd been living up in Aberdeen. He'd been basically abandoned by his father, who'd gone off to France and then died. So he was living with his mother, and she was Scottish. So they lived up in Aberdeen. And then he was obviously only 10, so he had to go to school and then university. And then he came into his inheritance and finally managed to get into Newstead when he'd come of age.
Okay, thank you. The mouse, Zoe, the mouse on top of the west front. And I confess, when I saw it, I thought that looks very Beatrix Potter-esque. It could come from one of her novels. But the question is that a traditional masonry carving? Is it unique to Newstead, this idea of leaving a modern mark? And is the carving a traditional sort of approach to modern conservation?
Probably not I would say that it's a very traditional idea of the mason to leave a mark on the stones that they are carving. It's probably not a recommended piece of conservation practice in modern times to do that. But nonetheless, it's a very high level, and I suppose only seen by a limited number of people. So I thought it was an interesting detail, probably not something that we would do now, but nonetheless of interest.
Again, I guess it adds to the story, and it's like a signature, rather like a mason's mark, isn't it?
Yeah.
You get on many buildings. Okay, so the next question is back to you, Emily, and that is, there is a story published in 1924 which mentions that William, the 5th Baron, shooting his coachman. Is that one true?
Still mute myself. That is one which I believe would have started circulating around the time of his trial in 1765. There's a gentleman called Horace Walpole who just loved to gossip, and he was saying at this time, he's been accused of this murder, so now all these other stories are circulating, all grievous stories as he called them, and this was one of them, I believe. I haven't found any evidence to say that he did that. I expect it was probably something along the lines of he had a dispute with the coachman and dismissed them. But yes, the myth is that he shot his coachman because he wasn't pleased with how he was driving, and then he threw the dead body on top of his wife in the back of the carriage. So it's quite a story, but I'll keep looking. If I find any evidence, then I will certainly broadcast it.
Okay, brilliant. It's interesting, you mentioned Walpole, and one of the things which struck me about the presentation is when you mentioned the sale, and the same thing happens throughout the 18th century and 19th century in many of these great houses, where you lose the contents of these places. So Strawberry Hill, Horace Walpole's house, same thing happens there. The contents go. And Stowe House in Buckinghamshire, same thing. All these magnificent contents go. So do you think this is something which happens in the 18th century, or is this something which is common throughout? I
should think people are always a bit irresponsible with their money, aren't they? That's it's not necessarily a new thing. I can't speak for outside of the 18th century, but as you say, it is not unheard of at all, fairly common. From the historian's point of view, obviously it's very sad that they had to go through this, but this rich, amazing picture that we get from it. It was something that I really relied on a lot writing the book, in terms of being able to recreate what it must have been like to walk around Newstead, and knowing what colour the drawing room was, and knowing that, you know, what exactly was in the Fourth Lord's study, what might have inspired him as he was writing that sort of thing. So it's a sad sort of a source, but really, really useful, obviously, for our purposes today.
Indeed, so useful as a historian, but also potentially useful for Nottingham City Council and the curators of the place, so that if they wanted to reconstruct, they'd at least have an idea of what went into certain rooms.
Absolutely, yeah. And one other thing that just popped up in that great sale of in the art sale of 1772, there's a mention of a Da Vinci, I think of some cherubs or something, and I think I don't know if it's lost, but it's not known exactly where it is right now, but I think that would be a great thing for heritage sites to be able to look at these things and maybe try and, you know, if they've got some money, get back a bit of the same collection. They know where they might have been hung on the walls. There's all sorts of things that could be used there.
Indeed. I mean, again, one of the ideas of refurnishing houses which have lost their contents is an interesting and current theme, referring back to Strawberry Hill. Part of their program has been to create facsimiles to return Horace Walpole's collection back into this very important house, to give people a real feel of what Horace Walpole would have wanted people to feel when they walked through the room. So it's a very relevant debate at the moment. And do you happen to know if there are any original bits of furnishing at Newstead? Have any been returned or left?
there are some paintings that are there, which I know, I'm not sure how they came in a roundabout way, maybe back to Newstead. They must have been purchased by the Museums Trust, I suppose. There were a few chimney pieces that, I think 4 chimneys that are supposed to have survived from the 18th century. But apart from that, I think, I'm not sure, to be honest. I can't think of it. They do a great job though of keeping things from the time of the poet, and you know, in the galleries that they've got there at Newstead today. So I'm sure it's on their radar. And they did just reacquire that picture of Sir John with the great beard just a few years ago. So I'm sure that's the thing they're working on.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, and there are lots of questions inevitably appearing now. It's always good to leave people hanging and wanting more, I feel. So it's really for me to firstly to thank both of you for really wonderful presentations. It's lovely to see scholarship, physical conservation, all those things coming together, research, all those things coming together in a way which really enhances Newstead Abbey and helps us to support its future. So thank you both very much for those wonderful presentations. Really, really appreciate it. So thank you both. I should also thank the people who've supported the conservation project at Newstead Abbey. So that is, apart from ourselves, there's the Newstead Abbey Partnership, Nottingham City Council, the owners, and Historic England. So thank you, because without that support and the support of people who generously gave to those organisations, actually that kind of work can't happen. So thank you very much indeed for that. And I guess it remains for me to say that Newstead is open to the public, is normally open to the public. So please go and visit once COVID permits it to do so, because it's a wonderful place, both the building, the rooms within the building, and the landscape itself. So it's well worth a visit. I encourage you to go and be inspired. Maybe not to write the same poetry at the same standard as Byron, but you'll still be inspired by going there. So I think we're going to end now to say thank you very much to our guests. Thank you everyone for coming. If you wish to read more about Newstead and Emily's research, then the book is available, and I have to say it's a fantastic read, and you've got a taste of it right now. And the final thing to say is, of course, please, we greatly appreciate everyone's support. So it'd be wonderful for people to continue or to support World Monuments Fund and all that we do, both in the UK and across the world. So I'd encourage you to support us, and that support can be financial, or it can be just about joining our mailing list and keeping in contact with us so that we can tell you what we're doing around the world. And on that note, with 1 minute to go, I'm going to say thank you all very much for coming. Have a very good evening, daytime, or whatever time of day it is with you, and indeed, first time I'm going to say it, have a very happy Christmas. Thank you very much.